All right, so I'm just going to go through, and what I'd like for you to do is, if you have notes or something or some way to write, can you define sociology?
Sorry.
Or write it down, so everybody will have a chance to do it. Can you define it?
It's the study.
Oh, but don't say it. I want everybody to do it.
Oh.
I'm looking at everybody. I know you were
Okay,
writing
I was
some
like,
of that. Yeah, without looking, could you define it without looking? Could you write a definition? How'd you do?
I already have it written down before this. So.
Did you? But would you be able to write it down again?
I mean, maybe not verbatim, but enough to get the concept.
What are the key elements of the definition? What would be the key elements?
The study of human interaction.
Okay, so music does that too, and literature does that, and philosophy does that. So, what could you add to that, William? Yeah.
It's a scientific study.
Okay, so there you go. You need to say that because there are many studies of human interaction, right? So, but it follows a scientific method. So it's a scientific study of human behavior in what capacity? As individuals? No, in groups. Human behavior in groups. So it really has three key elements to distinguish it. And it's good for you to know, what you're involved in here. So that's what I would suggest. And then I asked you to identify and to explain the significance of a historic social event or conditions that led to the origins of sociology. And we looked at that in that first chapter, where why were people so interested in human behavior in groups all of a sudden? They had been studying it, but why the need for a science? And what was going on? Can anybody answer that? What historic event led to the emergence of sociology as a discipline?
When Europeans were like conquering all the different lands, imperialism, where you start to learn different cultures, because you're essentially, in order to take over what you're taking over, you're going to meet different people in different cultures.
Well, you definitely do that. You definitely do. And that has happened, and that happened even after the event that I'm really thinking about. It continued to take place when people are going to other cultures and trying to learn about them. But there was some real visibility of society that hadn't existed before. Anybody else have an idea?
The Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely. It's the Industrial Revolution. So this is the springboard for the development of sociology. The Industrial Revolution. What was significant about that? How did that change society? Because society didn't change for a long time.
Because people that were like in lower class, I guess you could say, were able to, springboard into more like suburban areas and stuff like that.
Well, that came later. They were in urban areas first. Yeah. So if we're talking about the late 1800s, which we are, then we're talking about a lot of people no longer, and this originated in Europe, Western Europe.
Yeah, they're not as farming, I guess, as much.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a movement, it's a transition from an agrarian to an industrial society. And we see that again when we look at types of societies in Chapter 5. There are places in the world going through this right now, but Europe went through this in the late 1800s, and we saw early sociologists writing about that time. From agrarian, right? Or we would say agricultural, but we're using mechanization for that type of cultivating the land. But agrarian society into industrial society. It meant a lot. What happened as a result of that? How is society different in industrial, okay, you do have capitalism, yes. Bureaucracies are created, yes. Rosie, what were you going to say?
We are modernized.
In what way? What does that mean?
Like virtually every way. We don't rely on our working hands. We rely on factories.
There you go. The factory system starts to change. People are collecting in urban situations, right? In large industrial cities, families are, very often torn apart. People are working away from the home. They're no longer producing goods that they need. They have to work for wages and then purchase those kinds of things. So it changes the family. The early industrial cities were crime-ridden, overly crowded. You've got the collection of people from many, many locations, right? So there is this visibility of, all cultures are not the same. So a lot of things come together for the development and need for the development of sociology. By the way, who's the father of sociology? Yeah.
But what's the significance of it? Like people coming together?
Yeah, they're living they're coming from many locations. The society's different. Now, there's lots of significance about it, but there's a lot of crime. People don't know each other. They don't rely on each other because they're not similar anymore,
Okay.
right? Families are torn apart. If you ever look, I have this image of a class picture from early industrial times, and it's all kids, and they're all missing limbs because the early factory systems were extremely dangerous, long hours. That capital, that surplus that we got was extracted from their limbs and their labor. And so those are the time. That's what we're looking at. But back to the question, who's the father of sociology? Auguste Comte. Would you consider Comte a conflict or functionalist thinker if you had to make a guess? Absolutely. And he wanted to return to the past, didn't he? He said individualism is the disease of the Western world. He wanted to develop a science of society to bring back the past because he didn't like what he was seeing. I mean, it didn't look good at all. So, exactly. Can you see if you can write a definition without looking of the sociological imagination? C. Wright Mills's famous concept, the sociological imagination. How'd you do? No comment. Well, this is what you're trying to develop this whole course. And it's C. Wright Mill's concept. You'll see it in chapter 1. In the first, maybe the second slide I'll show you is a pretty good picture I found of him. He was at University of Texas at Austin. Famous sociologist. 1959, he wrote The Power Elite and developed this concept too. But it's the ability to connect your private troubles with public issues. It's the ability to connect or understand the relationship between private problems and public issues. And see, this is important because I think I could say in the U.S., we focus a lot more on individualism, and we tend to think that everything we've done has been an autonomous, free decision. And as a result, everything that happens to us was an autonomous, free decision. And what C. Wright Mills is saying is, well, you need to understand what's going on in the larger society around you and how that's played out in your life. Because if you don't understand that, you need to have both. Because if you have only one without the other, you're missing the full story. So if you lose your job, people could say, well, what did you do? Did you not show up? Are you lazy? Blah, 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 and give you individual reasons. But if you're part of the defense industry in the 90s, you lost your job because the defense industry was declining, right? So then it starts to take on a whole new meaning. Or you could say, well, this person is a heroin addict because, they don't have good willpower or they're immoral. Or you could say, well, they're part of a larger situation that we have in our society with the heroin opioid epidemic that is on the coattails of a huge increase in scripts for painkillers. Okay, so you see how that's different? Then, it's just you. No. Or, it's just a social policy or issue that won't affect you. Yes, it will. So you need to practice that definition, and you need to find an example to apply it to your own life. Okay? Let's look at the concepts of some of the early thinkers. Marx, for example. What comes to mind? What would you say about concepts related to Marx?
Communism.
What?
Communism.
Communism. Marx said, I'm not a communist. So that's not really, that wouldn't be from him, from a sociological standpoint. But
Or socialist, is that better?
Capitalism.
no, he was critical of capitalism. He criticized capitalism because when he looked at it, he said, oh my goodness, we have the potential to now produce enough goods and food and everything else for everyone with this factory system, but that's not what's happening. Instead, what's happening is the factory owners are taking everything, and the workers are barely given enough to keep them alive. They were called wage slaves. So he said, what's happened here? And that got him along his lines of thinking of what can we do? Can you have private property ownership and still be interested in the common good or not? He talks about a couple of concepts. One's called false consciousness. What is that?
Is it basically you have the wrong mindset about something?
Yes, you do, but can you be more specific? It is the wrong mindset, but it has to do with class. I don't mean our class, I mean social class, right?
Like thinking we're better than we are.
What?
Thinking that we're better than we are.
Better in what way?
Like socioeconomically.
Well, maybe, but what if you're suffering? Can you still have false consciousness? If you're at the
Yes.
bottom, okay, yes, you can. What is false about your consciousness?
You have a distorted viewpoint of yourself.
Yes, what's the distortion?
Usually you think yourself is better or worse.
Well, keep in mind it's a class. It's a group of people. Let's say if we're looking at the proletariat, it's all the workers have false consciousness. That means they think that their low position is their own fault. Okay? They're not working hard enough. They're not trying hard enough. So he said, what's really going on is they're being exploited in the system. And so his goal was to raise class consciousness, to make people who have a commonality aware of their common circumstances so that they could change it. Does that make sense? So false consciousness, in fact, even religion was described in a couple of ways by Marx. It could be the opiate of the people. Now that could mean two things. It could mean that it soothes their painful existence, or it could mean that it blinds them to their circumstance. Are you with me on this? Yeah?
We're still talking about Marx, though, right?
Yes, we're still talking about Marx, and we're talking about false consciousness and class consciousness. He also looked at, I think the other things that I might have given you were the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. You got a little bit of that in that first chapter. There's a lot more of it that comes later in the government chapter, which we're not covering, but there's a little bit of that there. But his main idea was that you tend to have two groups in a society. This is what he was seeing. He didn't see how capitalism developed. He died. Okay? So his ideas are time limited, right? But he did say that there are two main groups. What are those groups?
Maybe like in the one where it says the important people and then everybody else, is that the one you're referring to?
Well, kind of, but it's the haves and the have-nots. The haves and the have-nots. Which one is more numerous, the haves or the have-nots? The have-nots are more numerous. And so he believed that social change is a result of struggle for scarce resources. Okay? People are vying for wealth, power, prestige, all of these things. They're not divided equally. And so you have these groups competing for them. Typically, the haves have it, right? Hence the name. And they do a lot to keep the have-nots from getting it or even recognizing that they should have it. Okay? Whether it's wealth. That's important because that's going to play out every time we look at conflict theory. It's going to be a competition between the haves and the have-nots, right? You just looked at it in deviance. The conflict theory of deviance is saying, well, you have a criminal justice system that's not fairly applied to all groups. Or street crime is much more prevalent in the uniform crime reports than corporate crime. Why is that? Because corporate crime is by the haves. Okay, so anyway, that's a little bit about Marx. How about Weber? Looks like Weber, but pronounced Weber, our German sociologist. Can you identify any concepts related to Weber? Weber, anybody?
More economics, right?
Yeah, he's hard to pigeonhole. He expanded on Marx's ideas, but he also incorporated some other things. He had something to say about research that was relevant. Anybody remember his idea about how do you understand things if you're doing sociology? It's the concept of Verstehen. Verstehen. You remember that? And it's loosely translates to understanding, but this has had a lot of implications for research because it suggested that you can't really know about a social situation if you can't get inside the mind of the social actor. You can look at numbers, but that's not going to tell you motivation or meaning. And so Verstehen is one of his ideas. Another one of his ideas is the ideal type. The ideal type. And this is, we see, one of those that we look at later on is, you mentioned it, William, earlier, and that's the bureaucracy. He gave us the model of a bureaucracy because that was a new kind of people machine that was being created with industrialization, this huge hierarchy of positions and a lot of red tape and a lot of authority that rested within a position that we've learned about in chapter 6. But he talked about the ideal type. That's usually an exaggerated form of something that we look at and then say, well, but the one that we see at Sears and Roebuck, which filed for bankruptcy today, did you know that? It's the late 1800s. Yeah, they're gone. And they were kind of like Amazon back in the late 1800s because they sold everything to everybody through a catalog. Anyway, but they're gone. What was my point with Sears? Was that if you look at Sears and the ideal bureaucracy, you'd say, well, it's kind of like that. And in fact, that could have been its demise because Sears didn't really change. When all the other business models changed, they had the way they did it. I'm just speculating here, but let's use it for argument. And then they didn't change. They didn't learn how to sell online. They didn't learn how to really shift their brand or their products. And that is chapter 11. Anyway. So that's some of that for Weber. You can relook at Weber. Durkheim has probably been given a lot more attention, though. Durkheim is the French sociologist who was studying what connects us. What is the glue that holds people together when they move from the countryside where everybody's alike to these industrial cities, yes.
Was it a common goal?
Kind of in the new cities, no. No, in pre-industrial society, yes. They had a common goal, they had common values, they had common ideas. He called this mechanical solidarity. It's like you're all little parts of a machine. You're all alike. Okay? Mechanical solidarity.
So it was like all alike, everybody working together as one.
Yeah, have you ever lived in a small town? You know what I'm talking about? Where everybody, everybody kind of has the same values and they do the same things and they go to the same, if they most of them go to church and they go to the same churches. They're just alike, so they cooperate with each other because their lives are the same. But what happens when people go into this new situation in a large industrial city where they come from a variety of cultures? What is going to make them cooperate with each other? That's what Durkheim was trying to figure out. And he said, what? Organic. What's organic means I generate it, right? I start it. Organic solidarity is the kind of cooperation that people engage in out of self-interest. It's not because they have the same interests. You have different interests, but you need each other. We're doing it, right? You need me, I need you in our cooperation with each other. But that's qualitatively different when you are living in that type of situation with organic solidarity. It means that you cooperate to meet your own needs, but it doesn't mean you necessarily care about each other. I care about you, though. This is an exception. Yeah, I do. But you know what I mean. I'm using an ideal type. Jumping back to Weber, right? Okay, so he talks about that. The other thing, Durkheim did something very remarkable. Anybody want to tell me what it was? He was a first.
He conducted the first sociological study on suicide.
That's right. He did the first sociological study. He used these principles and scientific method to study intentionally an act that we think of as very individual. He said it wasn't. You can predict suicide rates. You can still use what he found and make predictions about suicide rates, particularly anomic suicide, based on anomie, ANOMIE. On page 8. And anomie is a lack of norms. No rules in society makes people more vulnerable, okay, to, if we fast forward to chapter 7, to deviance. He says that the only thing that keeps us under control is we care about something, either our job, our family, coworkers, friends, or something, our reputation. If you have none of that, you're more likely to be deviant. Okay? So, back to the study of suicide, sure enough, he said, you know what? When I look at these, I see patterns in different countries, different situations, that what happens is Catholics have lower suicide rates than Protestants. Jews have even lower rates than Catholics. What is it? And men have higher rates than others, than women. That's still true today. And he said it's because they're less connected, they're more individual. In a Protestant religion, you have a direct relationship with God. You don't have a mediated one through, priests or rabbis. So you're out there exposed and more vulnerable to at least that kind of suicide. So yes, that's what he did. Distinguish between functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction. So those are the three that we've been looking at and using as conceptual tools all the way through. Conflict theory, by the way, it was really, we trace it back to Marx. We can also trace it to Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was also a conflict theorist, but he was looking at the lives of African Americans particularly in Philadelphia. I had the occasion to go to Philadelphia to the ASA meetings. I took the Webb Du Bois tour. Awesome. Saw exactly where he did his research and went to the oldest black church in the nation. It was actually owned by a free slave. It was in the late 1700s, and saw all of that history. It's very remarkable.
Sorry, I was writing down that.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so it's conflict theory.
Conflict theories. Conflict theory is the idea that there are, you have a group of haves and have-nots who struggle for scarce resources, okay, over and over again, wherever that might be. And I also mentioned Webb Du Bois because he's another conflict theorist.
Yeah, have-nots that struggle for, what was that?
Think about it.
For
What do they struggle for?
Equality.
Well,
the wants of them.
what?
I guess just for the wants of what they need, just generally everything, honestly, because it has to have everything, and that's obviously don't.
Yeah, it's wealth and power, right? Things boil down to that. Wealth, power, prestige, those kinds of things. Why are those things scarce? Back to you, because you just said it. You did. Why is it scarce? Why do we have scarcity?
Was the equality what you said?
Yes, and you did say equality, but why do we have scarcity? Because the haves take too much. You don't have equality, right? Does that make sense? So that's it. It's just the same thing that plays out over and over again, whatever we're looking at. That's conflict theory. Functionalism. Functionalism it dominated sociology until the 1950s, through the 1950s. If you went to school and studied sociology, once it came from Europe over to the U.S., it would be functionalism. And Rosie, you mentioned Parsons. He was a chief functionalist there. But functionalism is the viewpoint that society operates like an organism, and all institutions within society are working together to keep a balance, and they're all working toward the benefit of society as a whole. I would say it's an optimistic view. Would you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So communities working together
to meet society's needs. The family creates people and socializes people so that they can go into the economy, and the government tells them what to do. The educational system teaches them, and blah, 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 all this, So it's like an organism. Balance and homeostasis is what is important. Now, we have to add Merton, Merton, to this analysis. Robert Merton saved functionalism after conflict theory came on the scene. He saved it because he said, not everything's functional. Some things are dysfunctional. Have you heard that term before? I used to be a family therapist, and we started talking about dysfunctional family. Yeah, that was the buzzwords. Dysfunction, right? Because it's a system. It's systematic. It's a system problem with the family's dysfunctional. What I call it post-functional, because what they're doing used to work, but it doesn't anymore. They just didn't change, But anyway, but Merton said, okay, if you want to still use functionalism to analyze social situations, here's what you can do. Look at the manifest functions. Those are the obvious functions of a situation or an institution. And then, so what would be a manifest function of coming to school? It's written down, everybody knows it's obvious. To get an education, okay? But he said you can look at that, but actually you have to scratch the surface, and you can also see hidden or latent functions. And sometimes these are the real motivators, right? So what would be a hidden or latent function of going to school? Meeting new people, absolutely, meeting new people. They used to say get an MRS degree back in the 50s, right? MRS, a Mrs. degree. Find a mate. We went through a time before the law changed, and this was a big deal, especially in the 80s. Some people went to school to stay on their insurance, keep insurance, because it was only students who could stay on their parents' insurance. It wasn't based on age. And so, some people, they were diabetic. I'm here because I need insurance, right? Isn't that interesting? So that's what Merton does. He says you've got obvious functions and then less obvious ones, and you can look at those. And then symbolic interaction is a theory. It doesn't contradict the other two necessarily. All it does, it's a micro theory. The others are big picture macro theories. It's a micro theory, and it tells us how these things play out. So if I wanted to study the latent function of getting an MRS degree in a college classroom, I could study the way people interact and find out more specifically. So symbolic interaction is a more of an analysis of small groups and how they create meaning through their interaction. Every time you interact with someone else, you're creating a meaning, a reality. I'm creating one with you right now, right? Hopefully, But we do that all the time. And that's the focus there, but we'll get more into that in this upcoming chapter. Recognize examples of major theoretical perspectives and their application to social life. So I might give you examples, and then you could say, oh, well, that's from a conflict perspective, obviously, or that's more of a symbolic interactionist perspective. You sit outside and you watch, and you see that based on gender, there's some people open doors for others, more so based on gender. What would that be? What perspective would that represent?
Symbolic interaction.
Absolutely, because I'm just taking a microscope and understanding it. And maybe I use that as evidence of gender roles and inequality among gender. Who knows? But that wasn't really what I was focusing on at that point. Okay, so let's go to 7. Why does it matter? What matters about using the scientific method? What's the reason for it? Why does it matter? Yeah, go ahead.
Studies.
What?
Studies.
Okay, say more. Studies. Why use the scientific method?
It
Yes.
makes us think about it instead of just trying to find an easy answer.
Makes you think about it, yes, but think about it in what way? I mean, we can think about things. What are we thinking about? You had your hand up. What did you want to say?
How to get a basis on how we function based off certain situations, maybe?
Well, that's your goal. That's what you're trying to do. But why use the scientific method? What is it? It's
It's the best way we know how to get information from a certain, wherever we're studying.
objective information. That's the key. It's an agreed upon system. People have agreed that these are the steps to the scientific method that are required in order to reach more objective, non-biased results. Okay? That's why. Because we don't have to do that, and most people don't do it. So it's becoming, more rare, I would say, in our way of knowing. How many of you consult scientific journals to get your information? No. So it's kind of scary, really. But it's set up in a systematic way that's agreed upon. For something to be peer-reviewed and deemed as credible, you have to have gone through this. And people know what the steps are, and they know how to call you on it. And it built into it is skepticism. You do not prove anything with the scientific method. You fail to disprove things. Okay? Very important, because usually people will say our findings suggest. They don't say we've proven. That's because if you think you've proven something, guess what happens? Well, Maybe, but yeah, they should. And that's what science is about, that built-in skepticism. You're supposed to show the limitations of your study and people pick on that and try to improve upon it. It's a community effort. But what I was going to say is, if you think you've proven something, you stop looking.
Right.
You don't research. That's what research means. Keep searching. The scientific method is built. It's a continuum. It's built on that. You saw steps in the quantitative research method. Qualitative, not in your text, but it's used increasingly so. And usually, very often, these are used together. But the steps are outlined. You start off in the quantitative method. You start by identifying a problem, right? And then you look at what everybody else has done. You review the literature. And then you might develop hypotheses. And then you establish a research method and you collect data, analyze your data, give your results, limitations of the studies, and share your findings. The critical element with both of these is that the last step is to share your findings with others for two reasons. You share your findings so that others can benefit from what you've done. You're contributing to that body of knowledge. And the other reason is so they can scrutinize your work, criticize it. That's important, you know. We don't do that. We shield ourselves from it. So it's really important, you know. Okay. We looked at some pros and cons of various research methods, survey research, advantages and disadvantages, experiments, using secondary sources, pros and cons of those. I would encourage you to look over those. I probably should keep my eyes on the time here. You did not have the opportunity to go through. You did visit an article, but you did not go through and identify the steps. But I just want you to know that when you read a research article, it follows the same. It follows the steps. You'll see the literature, and then you'll see methods, and then you'll see hypotheses, methods. It's the same thing. So hopefully that will help you. Credible and non-credible sources of information. Where would you go, particularly online, to find credible or non-credible? Could you identify what those were? Yeah.
Credible or .org or .gov?
.org or .gov, maybe a .edu. Yeah. What would be non-credible?
.com.
Yeah, it's a commercial. It has a bias. Doesn't mean there's not information there that might be useful. It's just that you have no way of knowing, and it hasn't been scrutinized. There's no peer review process. It's just and there's a tendency for it to be more sensational to sell. All right. Can you identify mean, median, and mode? And could you understand or how to interpret a correlation coefficient? So those are some of the easy statistics, or descriptive statistics, I should say, that we went through. The most common score would be called what?
The average.
No, not the mean or the average. The most common score, the mode. That's the most frequently occurring score. If you wanted to sell shoes, buy a whole lot of size 8s for women. 7s and 8s, right? That's the mode. Okay. The mean is an average. The median is the 50th percentile. It's probably the best to use for understanding income levels. Okay, it's more descriptive there. Correlation is a number that tells you about the relationship between variables. Tells you about the relationship between variables. It's expressed it's somewhere between positive and -1. Correlation. Mm-hmm. If I said the faster you drive, the poorer your gas mileage, what type of correlation would that be? Positive or negative? As speed goes up, what happens to gas mileage? It goes down.
So it's
So if
like,
they go in, yeah, that's a negative correlation. They move in opposite directions.
okay.
Right. If I said the more you study, the better your grades, higher studying, better grades, they're moving in the same direction, it's positive. Okay. All right. Let's look at culture, subculture, counterculture. What's the difference between or can you define culture? I gave you a real simple definition.
Is it kind of how the society lives and believes?
Absolutely. I said it was a blueprint for a society, right? Tells you what to think, eat, wear, believe, value, do. It's a big script for a group of people. So it includes a lot of aspects. A subculture is similar but unique. Unique enough to be set apart and recognized. And a counterculture is different in what way?
It's the complete opposite. Right?
Yeah, it's usually intentionally going against a dominant culture. So part of culture is material. It consists of all the things we can see. This is material culture. This is material culture. You know, this room is, the lights are. And some aspects of culture are non-material. That includes language, beliefs, values. Non-material culture. Yep. Which changes faster? Absolutely, material. Material culture can change very rapidly, and as you looked into our types of society, you saw, oh my gosh, postmodern societies like 10, 15 years old. Unbelievable. And all of that shift has been a technological shift, bringing, society into different realms. Cultural universals simply are just things that you find in any cultures. Like all cultures have death rituals. Some way, usually these cultural universals come because of our biological imperatives, All cultures have to make sense of death, for example. So even though it's not exactly the same in every culture is going to have it, a universal.
So it's based off beliefs? Okay, sorry.
Not necessarily. It's based on realities of our existence, okay? Our physical, things that happen to us we have to explain in some way. It could be a belief, yes. What is the difference between ethnocentrism and cultural relativity?
Ethnocentrism is when you're more biased?
In what way? Yes.
Towards your own.
Your own way of doing things, your own culture seems superior. With ethnocentrism, it's a belief that our own way of doing things, our own culture is superior. Okay? It's biased in that way. And it's kind of a natural thing. If you grow up in a culture, you don't grow up to hate it, typically, or you're not going to stay with it. So we come up with that, but it's a big problem.
You know what it reminds me of? I saw this meme. It's like, it was telling me how, it was saying how Americans most of the days were all like, oh, we're really, really bad, but when 4th of July, we're like, go America! And then the next year we're like, oh, okay, this is capitalism, stuff like that.
Interesting. There you go. Yeah. But exactly. Yeah. But I mean, families do this too. The way I do things is seems like it makes more sense or what have you. But it gets in the way. Cultural relativity is the practice of judging another culture based on their standards, not your own. With cultural relativity, you evaluate another culture based on their standards. Does it work for them? I mean, In India, it makes sense to revere cattle. In Texas, people don't understand that, you know? But the exchange of, in an arid environment, and exchange grain for beef, 5-to-1 ratio, it makes no sense to want to eat hamburgers all the time in India, right? See, if you judge that practice in that culture, it makes more sense.
So, it's the, I just lost it.
Cultural relativity? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes, ma'am.
Cultural relativity is the ability to evaluate a culture based on their standards, not your standards. Yeah. Okay, let's look at language. Language is very important because it's the way that we have transmitted culture from one generation to the next. We have language. Just think about it. That means that we can encapsulate solutions to problems. We can pass down views, beliefs, values, all of those things because we have language. So it's allowed us to move ahead. We don't have to start from scratch with each new generation. Language allows culture to accumulate. It's said that that's what makes us more unique, although that's a little controversial, but as humans, we have language. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, can anyone tell me what that is?
It states that language shapes our interpretation of reality.
Yes, language both reflects what we think is important and also guides our mind toward what is seen as important. So, according to Sapir-Whorf, language shapes our reality. We think a lot about time, for example. We have seconds, minutes, nanoseconds, decades, eons as expressions of time. And in some cultures, time is long ago or very long ago. Not very specific, but it doesn't matter. So you can look at a language and see, and we create language to reflect what we see. See, nobody could look up meme, 10 years ago and know what it meant. They'd call it a meme. That's your grandmother. So we create, isn't that interesting? We create language and then it ties us together and then we feel like some people know and some other people don't know. And it's,
On YouTube there's this, I forget, they're called the Fine Brothers or whatever, and they go by generations.
Yeah.
They'll have like the elders reacting to memes, and they're like seeing the difference between that. Or I'll have like all the young kids reacting to like the old Disney, like Cinderella, Snow White, stuff like that, seeing if they know that because it's a different generation.
Absolutely. Or some might say that, someone who's younger wouldn't know what it meant to say, call me. Hello? I mean, call? What are you talking about calling? Text me. No. Yeah. So, it's very interesting because it changes and reflects our realities. Okay, so let's see. Cultural values, beliefs, norms, mores, and folkways. Be sure that you know those. A value is a standard of what's good or bad, right or wrong. A belief is an idea about what's true. Norms are rules. And we've got two types here, folkways and mores. Which is more serious? Mores. They reflect morals. They're often written into law. A folkway is something that isn't very serious, but it helps you feel comfortable.
It's like a story, right?
No,
Oh, wait.
that's folklore. Folkway is a mannerism that people share, like opening the door for someone. That's a folkway. Or going like this. That doesn't mean hello everywhere. Or a folkway is if you say, how are you doing? What are you supposed to say?
Good. How are you?
Good, how are you? I heard someone say yesterday that the new thing everybody's saying is, I'm busy. Wow, I'm real busy. Oh man, I'm busy. I'm so busy. It's like, that's a weird thing. Are we supposed to be
Anybody say that?
busy all the time? Yeah. Anyway.
I
It,
and I get people that tell me like, don't tell me what to do, and I'm like, okay.
yeah. But those are folk way.
Yeah, I get people that say that.
Yeah.
They're like, have a good day, and they're like, don't tell me what to do. I'm like, okay.
Ah. Oh well, it didn't have the effect of bringing people together.
Like, oh, you have a good day too, or something. And now I get people that are like, don't tell me what to do. I'm like, alrighty then.
I've said
Oh.
that as a joke, no
Oh.
actually.
No, I've had people like straight up just be like, don't tell me what to do. I'm like, okay, bye.
Oh, I'm sorry. But okay, cultural lag is the tendency for part of culture to change faster than others. We see cultural lag. I gave you an example, I think, in my lecture of the first car phone or cell phone where you could text that had buttons on it was in 1996. And it took 20 years to write a law that says no texting while driving. 20 years. That's cultural lag, isn't it? Unbelievable how much lag there is sometimes. Let's see, where am I? Culture shock. Culture shock is the feeling you have when you are immersed in a brand new culture. You feel disoriented. You don't know where you are. And I gave the example too. We've applied this to healthcare. When people find themselves in ICU, it's not just. I mean, it's a totally different situation. They may experience culture shock, or people who are in, a transition from high school to a university might experience culture shock. Or if you go, to another country, you experience that disoriented feeling. Okay, let's see, where are we now? Socialization. What is socialization? Theoretical perspectives of culture. I'm going to let you do that on your own. Okay, speed along a bit. If there's something I speed over and you want to ask, please do. Socialization has nothing to do with partying or meeting other people. Okay? Socializing is not the same thing. Our meaning is socialization is a process whereby you learn the rules of society. It's a process whereby we learn the rules of society. How do you learn culture? Through socialization. We also get a sense of self. We get a self-concept through socialization. A self-concept. So some of the theories of socialization include Mead and Cooley's theories of socialization, and they particularly focus on the development of self, of a self-concept. According to Cooley, we develop a self-concept through our interactions with other people. Primarily, we look at their responses to us, and we judge ourselves accordingly based on their reaction to us. That's Cooley. This can be a problematic process. If you're around people who are really negative all the time, you're going to have a poor self-concept. And maybe you shouldn't, but that's what's happened. Mead, on the other hand, talks about the development of the socialized self.
I'll be here tomorrow.
Okay, all right. See you then. Okay. I've got one late tomorrow too, right? Okay. See ya. Bye. He talks about the I and the me. Remember George Herbert Mead? You with me? Yep. And he talks about the I is the spontaneous part of the self. It's inborn. It's the part of you that's creative and uninhibited, and it's just your natural self. I like it because it's more positive than Freud's id.
For real.
It's spontaneous and creative. It's not a seething cauldron of untamed desires, as Freud would suggest. And so we have this, and gradually we develop a socialized self, which is he called the me. And we do that by learning how to see ourselves through another person's point of view. For example, if I say, "Who are you?" and you say, "I'm a student, I'm a father, I'm a parent, I'm an employee," I would say all of those are aspects of the me, the socialized self. The socialized self takes into account what other people think. As what?
Like, see, like how you label yourself, I guess, kind of in a way too.
It's how society labels you.
Yeah.
That's and you agree and you pick up on that. Oh, I'm a Texan, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you didn't come out of the womb thinking you're a Texan. Took a while. Mead also said that you can look at children's activities in this process and how it occurs. Initially, what they do is they just imitate somebody else's behavior. That's the imitation stage. And then they'll start to take on a single role. You see this, Halloween's coming, all these kids are going to have costumes on. They take on a single role. He called that the play stage, where they can take the role of a single situation, take the role of one other person. And then gradually, they progress to the game stage. In the game stage, children have the ability to see themselves from a variety of angles. If a child can really play a team sport, they know what they're supposed to do in relation to everybody. They don't just run when the coach says run and turn when the coach says turn and stop when the coach says stop. Right? Have you seen little kids like that?
Yeah.
And they're not there yet, but they got them enrolled anyway.
That's T-ball.
It's T-ball. It is, isn't it? Yeah. And so, but the game stage, they can and they can see themselves from all of these angles, and they've taken on what he called the generalized other, and they've learned this socialized self. Okay, let's see. Let me move on. I'm going to let you look at agents of socialization and how they're important. That includes family, that includes peers, that includes schools, and so on. And you can review those notes. Anticipatory socialization, re-socialization, and the process of mortification in a total institution. Do those make sense to you? Would you like me to speak to any of those? I'm just watching my clock. I don't have to watch my clock, but I know you have obligations. Yes, all of that? Okay. Anticipatory socialization is where you start to act like a role that you're going to take on. Let's say I have a old notebook, and it was from probably 1948, and it has my mother writing her new last name. She was anticipating getting married to my father, so she wrote it a whole bunch on her notebook. And I could see, oh, I know you're in high school. You're supposed to be paying attention. What are you doing? Anyways, that's anticipatory socialization. So you walk into a role, kind of. It's when all of the people, as soon as they get in the nursing program, they're wearing scrubs all the time.
Oh, yeah.
They wear them to Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the part, right? Plus, they're comfortable. So that's it. Yeah. But that's anticipatory socialization. Resocialization is an effort to change your identity. And it happens in what's called a total institution. In AA, there's an effort to change your identity and to give you a new identity that's called an alcoholic. Okay? The military does that as well, right? They do these little things to show you who's in control. Somebody told me they had to paint rocks. Somebody else told me they had to count raindrops on the window. Nonsensical tasks just to show you who's in control, because they have to take your old identity away first. And they do that. They shave you, They do all of that to say, no, now you're coming out a different person.
Yeah, I was in the military.
You're in the military, so you went through that. Yeah.
Well, not to the paint rocks and rain thing.
Okay.
We didn't do that.
Okay.
Every bridge has their own different little
Yeah.
things to it, but pretty much it's just making everybody the same. So you get in there, you get shaved, everybody gets the same glasses, the same uniforms, you all do the same things.
That's right. That's right, and you'll be asked, and in very, very, in cults, that's another total institution. I will suggest, I've just finished reading a book, and it's all about nursing homes tend to be total institutions. Your identity's taken away, and you're given a extreme schedule. And anyway, a lot of those things happen, but the mortification process is taking away your identity and giving it back to you. So if when you go into AA, there's rituals that do that. If you go, "Hi, I'm Laura," and then everybody says what?
Hi, Laura.
And then, but I can't stop there. If I just say I'm Laura, I wouldn't say I'm Dr. Overstreet. They go, well, who cares, right? But if you say, "Hi, I'm Laura," I'm supposed to add to that. As I get more into accepting their definition, I would say, "Hi, I'm Laura, and I'm an alcoholic." And then you'd say, "Hi, Laura." That's a little mini mortification. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to let you refer to your notes about Jeannie. We're going to go into role status. How's everybody doing? I know I'm at 4:00, but I can keep going if you're good. Good.
I'll have to go here in a second.
That's fine. Is there anything further down you'd want me to pull out and address for you?
I just wanted to see an overall thing.
Okay.
How it's supposed to go, because every, teacher has the way they structure their
Yeah.
exams and
Yeah.
whatnot, but yeah.
Do you feel like you're getting it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. So we look at socialization. Then the next thing we started to look at is social structure. And we start off with the building blocks of society, the smallest units, the smallest way that society becomes part of your life through roles and statuses. Okay? This is number 28. A role is a set of obligations and rights that you have connected to a position. As a student, you have rights and obligations. A status is a position in society. The position that you hold is called a status. We all have a lot of statuses, and they have roles attached to them. But some of these we're born with, they're ascribed to us. These would include things like your gender, your race, ethnicity, social class. We start off with that. It would also include age, because even though we move through different ages, we don't control that. It's part of a biological process, right? And some are achieved. That would include things like, I'm a parent. That's an achievement. If you're married or divorced, or you're a nurse, or your occupation, and even ultimately maybe your social class by your own efforts would be an achieved status. There's often one that everybody's paying attention to more than any others. That's called your master status. It doesn't mean that's the one you think is most important. You're a sociologist here, right? It's the one that society keeps paying attention to. Sometimes we don't like that. Society may pay attention to gender instead of an achieved status. Okay?
What was the ascribed one?
It's the one you're born with, ones that you're born with, that you can't really change.
Okay.
Yep. So your master status is the one that most people see in you and react to in you, that society's paying the most attention to. Now, we talked about two sources of discomfort within roles. One's called role conflict. Role conflict involves two separate roles, two separate positions. We just had a student who had to become an employee, so she left, right? A minute ago. She had conflicting demands between her obligations as a student and her obligations as an employee. So, mom and employee is another one. That's role conflict, right? I showed in my on-campus class, we saw a video of with the storms, a police officer when he went home because his family, he was not supposed to go home, but he went home because his family, their houses were being flooded, and he got a lot of grief for it. That's role conflict, the conflict between those two obligations. Role strain is different. It happens within a single position. Role strain occurs, for example, a physician may need to prescribe treatment, but also try to navigate pharmaceutical reps that come through the door, and also maybe make decisions that are difficult because of what insurance allows versus what this patient can do. You see, it's just within that single position, there's complexity.
That's mostly like a lot of that I see in jobs. I feel like
What?
a lot of the examples would be like in jobs.
Yeah, in jobs, you may have too much to do. You may have somebody that's really difficult. You may, but it's within there. You're having midterms. I don't know how many you're having, but you may be having student role strain right now. So, okay, primary and secondary groups. This is looking at when we put roles and statuses together, we create groups. Groups are people who are interacting, and their roles or statuses are combined. Parent-child, professor-student, whatever. Those are groups. Now, there are two different kinds of groups we're looking at, and these come back to Cooley. And Cooley was looking at the quality of the kinds of groups that we have. In pre-industrial societies, people spent a lot of time in primary groups.
And now it's family.
Yeah, family is a good example of a primary group. A family when you're in a primary group, people know you, they stick with you for a long time, it's intimate, you have a lot of face-to-face interaction.
So this is before.
Well, we have them now, but they used to be you spent more time in them than now, right? Yeah. So, and they put up with a lot. See you, thanks for coming. They put up with a lot. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, is this gonna be like on Canvas? Like the review?
This is
Yeah, it's on Canvas.
It's gonna be recorded though, right?
Yeah, if I'm successful in recording it, I will
Okay.
put it up. I'll have to render it and
That's
stick
what
it.
I was
Yeah.
asking. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that's primary groups. But when people move into large cities, like even here, you may feel like you're in groups all day, but you don't know anybody. Those are secondary groups. Secondary groups are task-oriented. They don't last that long. Because once the task is accomplished, people leave. They are impersonal, and they don't put up with much. They have rules. If you don't, if you violate it, at work would be another example. They let you go. That kind of thing. Okay. Where are we now? How are we doing? Functional conflict and interactionist perspectives. I'm going to leave that to you. I'm thinking that you're getting good at those. Is that safe to assume? All right. Then let's look at bureaucracies. These are these large formal organizations. One type of formal organization that we started to see with industrial societies, and we have a lot of bureaucracies now. They follow a hierarchy, meaning the further up you go, the more power a person has. They're based on a division of labor. Everybody does different things. The authority that's given is part of the position. Formal organizations are designed to achieve certain goals. So they're like a big secondary group, if you want to think of it in that way. But there's some before I go on to criticize bureaucracies, the reason they developed so much was because you can get a lot done in a bureaucracy. You really can accomplish a lot more. I mean, McDonald's produces a lot. I don't know how many zillions of burgers. They used to have it on the sign, and it got to be a number that nobody understood anymore. So, but they do it. It's consistent. It's the same all the time. They do the same kinds of things. Bureaucracies have some problems, and one is they aren't very flexible. They can't handle unusual situations very well. Bad news doesn't go up very well in bureaucracies, because if you bring up bad news to your superior, they're going to kill the messenger, blame the messenger there.
Don't throw don't throw a hitch in the chain.
That's right.
Keep it smooth.
That's right. That's right. There's a lot of emphasis on that. But that can lead to some bad decisions being made. Groupthink is the phenomenon which people don't really take a lot of information into account because they don't want to rock the boat. And we see bad decisions occurring as a result. There's some other problems with bureaucracies that I'll let you look on with your own Peter principle and things like that. Then we looked at types of societies. Which was the oldest type of society? What goes even further back than that? The simplest technology. There's all of in Linsky's theory, they're all based on their economic system. What would be the simplest thing you could do to go eat? No, I don't mean go to McDonald's.
I mean, go kill your food.
Yes, hunter-gatherer. It's the oldest, but it existed here 128 years ago. You know? Wow. That's earth-shattering to me to think about. Well,
What question?
I'm looking at number 32. Okay. That is crazy, isn't it? So for a long time, societies were like that. Now they're almost non-existent. But those types of societies had the greatest equality. People, there wasn't a big hierarchy. And there were a lot of customs of sharing, because that's what you did. You don't hoard it. There's no surplus. I can't go through all of that because out of the sake of time, but just notice that inequality actually peaks with agrarian society. The agrarian, kind of a tongue twister, agrarian. And so you start to see big differences between landowners and peasants or what have you. So, and then moving up, we finally got to industrial society, and then post-industrial, right? Which is funny, isn't it? Where everything's service occupations. In post-industrial society, everybody works in some service occupation. You know, they're about 40, 50 years old. But we're not even post-industrial. We're postmodern. That's even different. And so now we rely most heavily on media, right? And consumer goods. We're all about watching stuff and buying stuff. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, and it's not very old, so. Okay, mechanical organic solidarity we've already reviewed, but Toynez describes communities, and he says the type of community that you find in pre-industrial society is Gemeinschaft. Mine means personal, mine. That's how I remember it. Oh, it's all mine. You're mine. You're like me. But in a Gemeinschaft, people have the same values and preferences and beliefs. And they connect with one another out of that similarity. Yes. Yes. And you find that in pre-industrial societies. A Gesellschaft, people's communities are based on contractual relationships. They have a contract with each other. That's how they coordinate their activities. You find this in industrial and post-industrial and maybe post-modern societies. See, I think we're trying to find Gemeinschaft, community, sense of community in the midst of all this, in little pockets of ways, you know, even so on. Okay, let me move ahead. You can look at functionalist, and I've given you a lot about how media functions. It brings people together. It connects people who are far apart, but there are dysfunctions too. Be sure that you look at those. Conflict theory of media is that really it generates the interests of the haves. And it focuses on conflict. That what sells in the media is attention to how groups are in competition with each other. I'm looking at number 34. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
what stirs the pot, you know?
Yes.
Cause you watch news these days, I mean, it's almost, there's no good information anymore, just a bunch of junk about negative.
I know, because that's what it sells. And it has escalated because of that narcotizing effect. We have that effect where we've seen so much, we're getting numb to it. So how do you break people out of the numb? Give something even more exaggerated. It's really skewed, very skewed. Okay, let's see, where am I?
35.
Okay, 35. Examples of terms. Please note media monitoring, like headline news. You know, when people, this headline news. By the way, I was at the SeaTac airport at 5 a.m. on Sunday morning. I was coming back from Seattle, and guess what they had on all the monitors? Cartoons. Tom and Jerry and Wile E. Coyote. I couldn't believe it because it's always headline news, you know, and people were watching it and they were happy. I've never seen that before, and I fly there a lot, but I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, but you know, the headline news, the media monitoring, all we see is the most superficial information, but it keeps scrolling and we keep hearing it, and it's reinforced as if that's reality. And most people get their soundbite there and they don't come back for the real long, complicated story. So that's part of it. There are other ego casting. That's another term. There's quite a few terms. Hyperconsumerism. You know, just look at the terms, the unique terms. A filter bubble. You also watched about the filter bubble, studied this, looking at things. So I'll just leave you with that. And you did a whole analysis of how software is designed to keep an audience. Let's move to deviance. Deviance is not in the act. It's not an act. It's an audience's interpretation of an act. Okay? We consider who, what, where, when, and why something happened when we consider whether or not it's deviant. So deviant is the violation of a standard or norm, societal norm. Yeah, of a social norm. Stigma is very important. Stigma is a discrediting that occurs if you've been identified as deviant in some way. And what's really interesting about stigma is that it can also become part of a person's self-concept. You know, it does. And that can reduce their confidence and all kinds of things. So, you know, deviance can be very, or stigma associated with deviance can be very powerful. It becomes a status in a way. Techniques to maintain social control. These might include things like we have informal and formal methods of social control. The law is the way the government tries to have social control, formal social control over us, right? But gossiping is another way that people try to control others. It's informal social control. They use that in a Gemein shop. People just keep you in line by talking about you. Things like that. Okay, let's see what else I can say. I wanted to call your attention to Durkheim also believed that, and I said that earlier, that, you know, we are only moral, he would say moral or non-deviant to the extent that we're social. That, and if there are no norms, if you have a lot of normlessness or anomie, you're going to have more deviance. Milgram's experiment, you can review that. That's so current, contemporary. Here's the formal and informal social control. I got ahead of myself, I think, there on our list. Hershey's control theory, you probably just went through that this week. It was kind of an elaboration of what Durkheim said, but he said there are 4 elements to helping people stay under control, and that includes having an attachment to somebody else, you know, that's meaningful, having a commitment to not being deviant, What else? Do you remember the other two?
The reaction to if you were wrong, is that the shock one you're talking about?
No, I moved from Milgram and I'm going down to Hershey now in control theory. I'm looking at control theory. He said there's 4 aspects of, and these are put into practice in programs for youth all the time. And programs for all kinds of things, deviance. Even in AA, they do this kind of stuff. Have an attachment with somebody else. What else? Have a commitment to wanting to be not deviant. Being involved. In AA, they give you involvement by rotating tasks. So you're not always the person who makes the coffee or greets. You rotate positions. And then finally, having a belief system, some kind of value system that makes you want to not be deviant. So that's Hershey.
Okay, can you explain first there? I just now realized we're on 42. So I was thinking of Hershey as the candy. I was like, that's
No,
weird.
Travis Hershey. Oh, no.
I don't know why.
So where did I lose you? Look at his control theory. He says there's 4 aspects of keeping
The belief system was the last one.
belief system, involvement, commitment, and attachment.
Okay.
Yes. Anomie, you can look at that. Structural strain theory of deviance. This is pretty complicated, but you should know the types because it's all, Merton is looking at the difference between the means and the goals in society. Okay? There are socially acceptable means to achieve what everybody wants, and usually that's money and power or all of that. And so what he does is he makes a comparison of the means and the goals and whether or not people accept these. And in so doing, he shows us how society is, there's a strain within society, and this can lead to a lot of deviance. So for example, everybody wants to have have money and possessions. But some people, those are the goals. But some people don't want to go about it the way that's acceptable by working hard, getting a job, right? Instead, they want to steal something or cheat or something like that. They're called innovators. So look at all of those different types of responses to deviance from Merton's theory. Sutherland's theory of differential association basically just suggests that people learn to be deviant. If you're around a lot of people who are deviant and they see it as, and they value it, you're going to learn it like any other behavior. Okay? The labeling theory of deviance talks about primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is the initial act. Let's say you steal a bicycle. If nobody sees you, then a labeling theory is not going to apply. If you just steal a bicycle, because you're an innovator. But if you get caught, then and labeled as a little thief, then that label can perpetuate your deviance. People don't trust you. They might shun you. And yes. I'm just transitioned into secondary. The primary is the initial act. This theory doesn't tell us anything about that. But the secondary is the deviance that's perpetuated because you've been labeled. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay. So now here's the interesting part of this. Not everybody who does the thing, not everybody who steals a bike gets labeled, do they? And some people who didn't steal a bike get labeled. Uh-oh. So it doesn't matter if you really stole it or not. If you've been labeled a little thief, it can generate secondary deviance.
Kind of like that thing, like, this is how I'm thinking about it. Like when people come up to me, they're like, why are you sad? Or they're like, why are you mad? I'm like, I'm not mad. And then they keep on saying like, but you look mad, you're acting mad. And I'm like, then that makes me mad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you think, why try it? Which is really interesting because when you have systems that call out some group for what they did wrong,
But they didn't do
Yeah, when my kids were in school, they always had these, I forgot what they call them, but the kids who always had their folder signed, at the end of the 6 weeks, they got these little tickets and they got to walk to Sonic and come back with a shake, you know? And the thinking was, well, the others will see it and go, I want to get a shake too, by golly, I'm going to get my folder signed. No, it was the same people every time. And the people who were not getting the shake, the non-Sonics, kind of formed a little group. And they sat together at the lunchroom and they thought, why try? You know, they rebel. It takes on a life of its own. Okay. Functionalist and conflict theories of deviance, you can look at those. It's simply going to, as you can imagine, talk about, you know, some people make money on deviance. It does provide jobs. It also clarifies norms. But conflict theorists would say that deviance is really focuses on trying to keep some groups, you know, under thumb, and other groups get away with more. So it's an unfair labeling system that we have. And our criminal justice system doesn't really give an accurate reflection of what's going on. That's, you can look over crime categories. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive look at that, but I would suggest that you recognize that our crime statistics are limited. The statistics are primarily comprised of crimes that are reported, and a lot of crimes are not reported. So we do have victimization surveys that try to help remedy that, but we still, you know, we don't have a perfect picture of what goes on. There are more categories for street crime than white-collar crime, even though white-collar crime can affect more people. And please look at some of the trends in crime rates. You can look at that on your own. You also have a comparison of the U.S. and some other countries, and be sure to look at that. And I think that's it. Wow. Thanks for enduring. How did we do? We did an hour and a half. That's not bad for 7 chapters.
Yeah, we went over most of this.
We did go through a lot. Do you have any other questions?
Like if I have any questions, I'll be here tomorrow.
Huh?
Like if I have any questions, I'll probably
Yeah.
take it tomorrow.
If you do, come on tomorrow.